My name is Lena Whitaker. I was 31 years old when my father erased my name from a legal document and expected me to smile about it. He did it in front of 83 guests at my cousin's engagement party in Charleston, South Carolina. He did it with a gold Mont Blanc pen and a glass of bourbon sweating beside his hand. He did it while I was standing 10 feet away. Before I tell you how that pen moved across the page, do me a favor. If you've ever been the daughter who was capable but convenient to overlook the one who handled everything but never got credit, stay with me. Like this story, subscribe if you want the rest of it, and drop a comment if you've ever been told you were fine while someone else got favored. Now, let me take you back. The engagement party was for my cousin, Natalie Carter. It was hosted at my parents' house on Queen Street, a restored 1890s mansion with wraparound porches and columns that looked like they belonged on a postcard. My father, Thomas Whitaker, loved that house more than he loved most people. It was proof of money, of status, of control. My mother, Judith Whitaker, floated through the party in a pale blue dress, refilling glasses, adjusting flower arrangements, smoothing over tensions before they surfaced. My younger brother, Ethan Whitaker, 33, stood near the bar, laughing too loudly, already on his third drink before sunset. And me, I was there because I always was. I am an interior architect and co-founder of Whitaker and Rowe Design Collective. 31 years old, 22 employees, 2 offices, 1 in Charleston, 1 in Savannah. Last fiscal year, we cleared $6.4 million in revenue. I manage commercial builds, hospitality renovations, and large-scale residential restorations across the Southeast. I know contracts. I know zoning codes. I know how to read a structural plan and find the weak beam. What I didn't see coming was that the weak beam was in my own family. 3 months before that party, my grandmother, Margaret Hale, had passed away. She was the only person in my family who ever looked at me and saw something other than responsible. She left behind a will and a controlling share in Whitaker Restoration Group, the family business my father ran. Whitaker Restoration Group specialized in historic property renovations. I'd grown up walking job sites with my father. By 14, I could identify load-bearing walls. By 25, I was consulting on high-end preservation projects. My father liked to say I had a good eye. He never said I had authority. Grandma Margaret had once told me, sitting at her mahogany dining table, "Lena, when the time comes, this company needs someone who can actually run it." I thought she meant me. At the engagement party, my father clinked his glass with a fork. "Before we toast Natalie and Ryan," he said, smiling for the crowd, "there's a small family matter to address." Small. He held up a thin stack of papers. As you all know, my mother recently passed. Her will has been settled. There were a few adjustments to the company structure. My stomach tightened. A few adjustments. I knew the will. I'd read a draft 2 years earlier when Grandma Margaret had asked for my opinion. 51% of Whitaker Restoration Group was to transfer to me upon her death. 49% remained with my father. It was clean. It was intentional. She had looked at me and said, "You've earned this." My father continued. "After careful discussion with our family attorney, Robert Gaines, we've decided to consolidate ownership to ensure stability. The shares will be transferred under one managing partner." He turned his head slightly. "Ethan will be assuming majority control of Whitaker Restoration Group." Applause. Polite, confused, but applause. My ears rang. Ethan blinked like he hadn't expected the announcement to come that night. Then he straightened, grinned, lifted his bourbon. I didn't move. I felt the shift physically, like the ground under the Queen Street mansion had tilted half an inch. I stepped closer. "Dad," I said quietly, What are you talking about? Thomas Whitaker didn't look at me. He looked at the guests. It's about continuity, he said smoothly. Ethan has the right temperament for leadership. Lena's talents are better suited elsewhere. I had designed 3 of the company's highest-grossing projects in the last 5 years. The Charleston Harbor Hotel renovation, mine. The Beaufort Courthouse preservation contract, mine. The Savannah Opera House bid, I led it. Ethan hadn't set foot on a job site in 8 months. I heard my aunt whisper behind me, "Well, Lena's always been independent." Independent, the word people use when they mean excluded. I leaned toward my father. Grandma left her shares to me. Robert Gaines, our family lawyer, materialized at Thomas's side, like he'd been waiting for his cue. The will was amended 6 weeks before Margaret Hale's passing. Robert said, voice neutral, a codicil, 6 weeks. Grandma had been in hospice, on morphine. I looked at my mother. Judith wouldn't meet my eyes. She was focused on the tray in her hands, aligning champagne flutes that didn't need aligning. You knew I asked her. She swallowed. Your father handled it. The band started playing again. Laughter swelled. My cousin's engagement party resumed like nothing had happened. But something had, because I knew my grandmother, and I knew this smelled like betrayal. I walked out onto the back veranda, the humid Charleston air thick against my skin. I pulled out my phone and opened my email. I still had a scanned copy of the original will Grandma had shown me, 51% to Lena Whitaker. No ambiguity. Inside, I heard Ethan's voice rise. I'll do my best, he was saying. Dad's taught me everything. Everything except how to run a profitable project. I stared at the date Robert had just mentioned. 6 weeks before her death. That was the same week my father had insisted on handling her paperwork. That was the week he'd told me not to worry about visiting because she was too tired. A small event, a simple announcement, a shift of shares. That's how it starts. You think it's just a business decision, just a signature, just a formality. But standing on that veranda, listening to the celebration continue without me, I understood something cold and precise. This wasn't about continuity. This was about control. And if my father thought I was going to accept being excluded from my own inheritance quietly, he had just made the biggest miscalculation of his career. Because I designed structures for a living. And when I see a crack in the foundation, I don't ignore it. I tear the whole thing open to see what's underneath. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with a probate litigator named Daniel Mercer. And I didn't tell my family. Daniel Mercer's office was on the 9th floor of a glass building off Broad Street, 4 blocks from the courthouse. I chose him. The way I choose contractors, quiet reputation, clean record, no flashy billboards. He was 46, navy suit silver at his temples, the kind of lawyer who read before he spoke. When I walked in, he stood, shook my hand once firm. Lena Whitaker, he said, glancing at the intake sheet. Whitaker Restoration Group. You've heard of us. I've litigated against you once. Zoning dispute, 2018. You won. I remember, I said. We had the better survey. He gave a faint smile. So, tell me why you're here. I laid 2 documents on his desk. The scanned copy of my grandmother Margaret Hale's original will, and the updated codicil Robert Gaines claimed existed. Daniel didn't rush. He adjusted his glasses and read both versions side by side. The room was quiet, except for the hum of air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of paper. After 3 minutes, he looked up. The codicil transfers controlling shares from you to your brother Ethan Whitaker, he said. Executed 6 weeks before Margaret Hale's death. Witnessed by Robert Gaines and a paralegal named Cynthia Moore. Yes, and you're questioning capacity, undue influence. I'm questioning everything I said. He studied me a moment longer, measuring. Tell me about your grandmother. She ran that company before my father did. She built it from 2 employees in a pickup truck into a $20 million operation. She believed in documentation. She hated improvisation. And she told me repeatedly that I would take over. Did she ever express doubt about your brother? She said he was charming. Daniel nodded slowly. That's not an endorsement. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them still. She was in hospice when this codicil was signed, I said. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. On morphine. Weak. And who arranged the meeting? My father. And who kept you from visiting that week? My father. Daniel leaned back. All right. He turned the codicil towards me and tapped the signature. This is either legitimate, he said calmly, or it's contestable. But understand something, Lena. If you challenge this, it becomes public. Your father, your brother, the company. The word inheritance gets ugly fast. I'm not afraid of ugly, I said. He watched my face carefully. This won't be quick revenge, he added. Probate litigation in South Carolina can take 18 to 24 months. We'll subpoena medical records, depose witnesses. It's slow. I build hotels that take 3 years from dirt to ribbon cutting. I said, I understand long timelines. There was a pause. Why didn't you confront your father first? Daniel asked. Because I already knew the answer. Because if he forged that document, I said evenly, he won't confess over dinner. Daniel nodded once. Fair. He closed the file. I'll start with medical capacity. If Margaret Hale was heavily medicated, if cognitive impairment can be established, we have leverage. Also, undue influence, if Thomas Whitaker isolated her. He slid a yellow legal pad toward me. I'll need a full timeline. Dates, communications, anyone present during that 6-week window. I exhaled slowly. Here's the thing about betrayal in a family business. It doesn't explode. It rearranges itself quietly. Titles shift. Email signatures change. In one day, you're CC'd instead of addressed. 3 days after the engagement party, I received an internal memo from Whitaker Restoration Group. From Ethan Whitaker, Managing Partner. Subject Leadership Update. Effective immediately. All executive decisions will be reviewed through my office to ensure strategic alignment. My office. I've been listed as Director of Design Strategy for 6 years. Now, my authority required review. I forwarded the memo to Daniel with one line. It begins. He replied 5 minutes later. Document everything. So I did. Every email Ethan sent that restructured reporting lines. Every vendor call I was suddenly excluded from. Every meeting my father attended without copying me. It escalated quietly. One Friday afternoon, I drove to the company headquarters on Meeting Street. Brick exterior, polished brass letters, Whitaker Restoration Group, etched across the glass. I had a key card. It still worked. The receptionist, Amanda Collins, mid-20s, nervous smile, stood when she saw me. Hi, Lena, she said. Ethan's in the conference room. I'm not here for Ethan, I replied. I walked past her toward my old office. The door was open. Inside, someone else's framed degree hung where mine had been. A potted plant I didn't recognize sat on the credenza. My nameplate was gone. I turned slowly. Amanda appeared behind me, flustered. Oh, I thought you knew. Ethan reassigned spaces. He said, since you're focusing on your other company. My other company. Whitaker and Rowe, she said carefully, as if that disqualified me. I smiled, not warmly, just enough to keep her from apologizing further. Where is my nameplate? I asked. I think it's in storage. Storage, like I'd already left. I didn't argue. I didn't call Ethan into the hallway and start a confrontation in front of staff. I walked back to my car, sat behind the steering wheel, and wrote down the date and time. You learn something working in construction. Demolition is loud. Structural failure is quiet. That night, my mother Judith called. Lena, she said gently, your father is worried you're overreacting. I haven't reacted, I replied. He says you're speaking to lawyers. I let that hang. He just wants unity, she continued. It's a family business. No, I said. It's a company. There was silence on the line. Ethan needs this, she added softly. He's been struggling. There it was. The old pattern. Ethan struggles. Lena compensates. My birthday had been forgotten 3 years in a row, while my brother got surprise parties. My promotion in 2021 had been overshadowed by Ethan's new direction speech at Thanksgiving dinner. Every milestone of mine became background noise to whatever crisis he was managing. Mom, I said evenly, did you see Grandma sign that codicil? A pause. I was in the room, she admitted, and she looked tired. Tired isn't the same as clear. She trusted your father, and that was the problem. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment overlooking the Ashley River, watching boats cut slow lines through dark water. I wasn't angry in the loud way. I was recalibrating. 3 weeks later, Daniel called. We have Margaret Hale's hospice records, he said. High-dose morphine. Cognitive fluctuation noted. 2 days before the codicil, a nurse documented disorientation. My fingers tightened around the phone, and I asked, and the notary listed on the codicil, she's not registered in Charleston County. Silence. What does that mean? I asked, even though I knew. It means, Daniel said calmly, this may not just be undue influence. He paused. It may be fraud. The next morning, I received an invitation in my inbox. Subject, Whitaker Restoration, Annual Shareholder Meeting. Location, the Charleston Maritime Club. Date 4 weeks from now. Ethan had scheduled a public presentation of new leadership direction. He was going to formalize control. In front of investors, in front of clients, in front of the press. And he expected me to sit quietly in the audience. I forwarded the invitation to Daniel. His reply was short. Perfect timing. 4 weeks. Enough time to prepare a confrontation that wouldn't just be emotional. It would be surgical. And this time, I wouldn't be 10 feet away watching a pen move across paper. This time, I would be the one holding the document. The Charleston Maritime Club sits right on the harbor, all glass walls and polished teak floors, the kind of place designed for quiet power plays. I've presented design concepts there before. I've watched men in Navy suits negotiate multi-million-dollar restoration contracts over shrimp cocktails. 4 weeks after Daniel Mercer told me the codicil might be fraudulent, I walked into that building as a minority shareholder in my own family business. The annual Whitaker Restoration Group shareholder meeting was scheduled for 6:00 p.m. on a Thursday. 87 confirmed attendees. Investors, long-term clients, preservation board members, 2 local reporters. My father loved optics. Ethan loved applause. I arrived at 5:42. I wore a charcoal suit, tailored sharp lines, nothing soft about it. My hair was pulled back. Minimal jewelry. I didn't come dressed like a daughter. I came dressed like litigation. Inside, my father, Thomas Whitaker, stood near the front podium, reviewing note cards. Ethan Whitaker was working the room, shaking hands, smiling, like he'd already won something. My mother, Judith Whitaker, stood near the back with a clipboard, checking seating assignments. She looked smaller than usual. When Ethan saw me, his smile flickered. Hey, he said, walking over. Glad you made it. I'm a shareholder, I replied. Of course I'm here. He adjusted his cufflinks. Tonight's about forward movement. No need to complicate things. Complicate. You reassign my office, I said calmly. You remove me from vendor approvals. That's already complicated. He lowered his voice. Lena, this is business. Don't make it personal. That sentence almost made me laugh. At 6:03, Thomas stepped to the podium. Thank you all for coming, he began, smooth-practiced. Whitaker Restoration has always been about legacy. Legacy. He talked about growth projections, about expanding into coastal Georgia, about restructuring leadership for efficiency. Then he gestured toward Ethan. I'm proud to formally introduce our new managing partner, my son, Ethan Whitaker. Applause. Ethan stepped up, nodded at the crowd. "For those of you who have worked with me," he said, "I value innovation." Innovation from a man who hadn't completed a project independently in 5 years. He clicked to a slide deck. Charts, revenue forecasts, strategic pivots. He spoke confidently, but I recognized the numbers. They were mine, my projections, my Savannah hospitality expansion model repackaged. He didn't credit me once. Halfway through his presentation, I felt my phone vibrate. Daniel Mercer. I stepped quietly toward the side hallway and answered. "They just confirmed something," Daniel said, without preamble. "The hospice nurse who documented your grandmother's disorientation. She's willing to testify." I leaned against the wall, and I asked, and we obtained surveillance logs from the assisted living facility. The day the codicil was signed, Robert Gaines wasn't there. The air felt thinner. "What do you mean he wasn't there?" "He signed as witness, but he never checked in that day." A cold, precise realization slid into place. If Robert Gaines wasn't present, then who witnessed the signature? I walked back into the ballroom as Ethan concluded. "And under this new structure, we anticipate a 20% increase in market share over the next 18 months. Applause again. Thomas stepped forward. "Before we close, are there any questions from shareholders?" There it was. I didn't raise my hand. I stood. The room shifted. Thomas saw me immediately. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Yes, Lena," he said carefully. I walked to the center aisle, not to the podium. I didn't need elevation. "I have a question regarding governance," I said, voice steady. "Specifically, the codicil, executed 6 weeks before Margaret Hale's death." Silence fell fast. Thomas kept his expression neutral. "What about it?" "I'd like clarification on the circumstances under which it was signed." Ethan shifted behind him. "This isn't the forum," my father began. "It is precisely the forum," I interrupted, still calm. "We're discussing leadership legitimacy." A murmur rippled through the room. I continued. "The original will allocated controlling shares to me. The codicil reallocated those shares to Ethan. We now have medical documentation indicating Margaret Hale was cognitively impaired at the time of execution." Someone near the front leaned forward. Thomas's voice cooled. "Lena, this is inappropriate." "Inappropriate," I repeated softly, "would be ignoring potential fraud." The word landed. "Fraud." Ethan stepped towards the microphone. "That's a serious accusation." "It is," I agreed, "which is why my attorney has filed a petition in Charleston County Probate Court to challenge the validity of the codicil." A ripple of surprise moved through the investors. Thomas went still. "You filed?" he asked quietly. "Yes." I met his eyes, and we have evidence that the listed witness was not physically present on the day of signing. The reporters in the back were no longer pretending to check their phones. Ethan's face had lost color. "You're trying to sabotage your own family business," he said sharply. "No," I replied. "I'm trying to protect it." I turned to the room. "For those of you concerned about operational continuity, Whitaker and Rowe Design Collective has independently secured $8.2 million in contracts this fiscal year. My leadership record is documented. My financial solvency is not in question." Numbers calm rooms. Thomas gripped the podium. "You're airing private matters publicly. You chose a public meeting to formalize control," I said. "I'm simply responding in kind." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of our oldest investors, Harold Benton, stood. "Thomas," he said slowly, "is there any merit to what she's saying?" Thomas didn't answer immediately, and that hesitation said everything. The meeting dissolved into fragmented conversations, investors clustering, Ethan whispering urgently to Robert Gaines, who had slipped in halfway through my statement, pale and tight-lipped. My mother stood frozen near the back wall, hands clasped. I walked out before anyone could stop me. On the harbor dock, outside, the wind cut sharp across the water. My phone buzzed again. "Daniel, you handled that?" he asked. I did. Good, he said. Because Robert Gaines just called my office threatening defamation. On what grounds? He didn't have any, Daniel replied dryly. But here's the part you need to know. I waited. We just subpoenaed bank records from Whitaker Restoration. 2 weeks after the codicil, $430,000 was transferred from company reserves to a private account under Ethan Whitaker's name. The dock creaked under my heels. For what I asked, unclear, but the memo line says consulting advance. Consulting. Ethan didn't consult on anything. I stared out at the darkening harbor. So it wasn't just about control. It was about money already moved, which meant if the codicil fell apart, so would everything built on top of it. Inside the Maritime Club, through the glass walls, I could see my father gesturing sharply at Robert Gaines. For the first time in my life, Thomas Whitaker looked cornered. And cornered men don't negotiate. They escalate. The next morning, I woke up to a headline in the Charleston Ledger. Whitaker Restoration Leadership Dispute surfaces at annual meeting. Family drama, inheritance conflict, allegations of impropriety. The words were polite, but the damage had started. And at 9:17 a.m., I received a formal letter from Whitaker Restoration Group's board. Effective, immediately pending resolution of legal matters, Lena Whitaker is suspended from all company-related decision-making authority. Suspended. Excluded. There it was, not just sidelined, removed. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on my kitchen counter. If they wanted a battle over legitimacy, I would give them one. But I wasn't going to fight for a seat at their table. I was going to build my own, and I already knew exactly which investors were quietly questioning my father. By noon, I had scheduled 3 private meetings, not to defend myself, to offer them an alternative. Because revenge in a toxic family isn't loud. It's structural. And I was about to redesign the entire foundation. The first investor I called was Harold Benton, 72 years old Charleston money. He had backed Whitaker Restoration Group when my grandmother, Margaret Hale, was still climbing scaffolding herself. Harold respected 2 things, numbers and steadiness. He didn't tolerate theatrics. We met at his private office on East Bay Street at 8:00 a.m. sharp. He didn't offer coffee. He didn't waste time. "Lena," he said, folding his hands, "is your father guilty of what you implied?" "I don't imply," I answered. "I document." I slid a folder across his desk. Not everything, just enough. The hospice record noting cognitive fluctuation, the discrepancy in witness presence, a redacted summary of the $430,000 transferred to Ethan's private account. Harold read silently. After a minute, he looked up. "If this codicil collapses, what's your plan?" That was the real question. "I'm not fighting to step back into the old structure," I said. Whitaker Restoration Group is too dependent on my father's centralized control model. It's outdated. He watched me carefully. "I'm proposing a merger," I continued. Whitaker and Rowe Design Collective absorbs restoration operations under a new holding entity. Transparent governance, independent board, financial oversight. You'd dismantle your father's company. I'd stabilize it. He leaned back. "Thomas won't agree." "I'm not asking him." Silence stretched between us. "Do you have capital support?" Harold asked. "Yes," I said. "Preliminary." That wasn't entirely true. It was conditional. But I knew how to read a room. Harold wasn't testing my finances. He was testing my nerve. "If the probate court invalidates the codicil," he said slowly, "you'd control 51%. "Yes." "And you'd restructure?" "Yes." He nodded once. "Keep me informed." That wasn't an endorsement, but it wasn't opposition. That afternoon, I met with 2 other investors privately. Same presentation, same controlled tone, no emotional language, no revenge rhetoric, just numbers, risk mitigation, compliance reform. By the end of the day, 3 out of 7 minority stakeholders had asked for detailed proposals. Meanwhile, Whitaker Restorations Board sent me another letter. Cease and desist from contacting investors directly. I smiled when I read it. They were rattled. At 7:30 p.m., my phone lit up with Ethan Whitaker's name. I answered. "What are you doing?" he demanded, without greeting. "Working. You're undermining the company." "I am the company," I replied evenly. "You think this is payback?" he shot back. "Because Dad didn't hand you the throne." I closed my laptop slowly. "You received $430,000 from company reserves 2 weeks after the codicil," I said. "Explain that." Silence. "That was a consulting retainer," he said finally. "For what?" "My strategic expansion plan." "You don't have one," I said. His breathing sharpened. "You've always thought you were smarter," he snapped. "But you don't understand pressure. Dad needed someone loyal." Loyal. There it was again. I'd heard that word my entire life. At Christmas, when Ethan missed deadlines, but I fixed them. At Thanksgiving dinner, when he forgot project specs, but I rewrote them. Loyalty meant silence. Loyalty, I said quietly, doesn't mean signing fraudulent documents. "You can't prove that he said." "We'll see." He hung up. I stared at the dark screen for a moment. Then my mother called. Judith Whitaker rarely raised her voice. When she did, it meant something had cracked. "You're tearing this family apart," she said. "No," I answered. "It was torn. You could settle this privately. Dad chose public optics." "He's scared," she whispered. "He should be." There was a long pause. "He says, if you withdraw the petition," she continued carefully, "he'll make you co-managing partner." I almost admired the audacity. 50-50, I asked. "Yes, and Ethan keeps control of financial oversight." "Lena." "No." I let the word land cleanly. "I won't accept half of what was legally mine, and I won't legitimize a forged codicil." "You're being rigid," she said softly. "I'm being exact." That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety, from calculation. If the codicil was invalidated, control shifted. But control alone wasn't enough. The $430,000 transfer mattered. It indicated motive. Fraud isn't just about signatures. It's about benefit. 3 days later, Daniel Mercer called again. "We deposed Cynthia Moore," he said, the paralegal listed as witness. And I asked. She admits she never saw Margaret Hale sign anything. The room felt still. She says Robert Gaines asked her to notarize. Later, Daniel continued. She assumed it had been handled properly. Assumed. "Is she willing to testify?" I asked. "Yes." That was the crack. And cracks spread. By the following week, local business media picked up the probate filing. Headlines escalated. Inheritance dispute intensifies. Family business under scrutiny. The board called an emergency session. I wasn't invited, but Harold Benton called me afterward. "They're considering removing Thomas as interim chair," he said quietly. That was faster than I expected. Why, I asked. "Investors don't like uncertainty." Translation: they don't like potential criminal liability. The following Monday, Whitaker Restoration Group's largest coastal development client suspended a $3.1 million restoration contract, pending governance clarity. That was the first real blow. When revenue freezes, loyalty evaporates. Thomas Whitaker called me at 10:14 p.m. that night. He never called late. "Come to the house tomorrow," he said. No greeting, no warmth. "I prefer legal counsel present," I replied. "This is your family. It's litigation," I corrected. Silence. "You think you've won?" he asked quietly. "No," I said. "I think the truth is surfacing. You'll destroy everything your grandmother built. I'm protecting it from what you did." His breath was slow on the line. "You don't understand the pressure I was under." "Then explain it," I said. He didn't. Instead, he said something else. "If this goes to trial, Ethan could face charges." Charges! That wasn't about shares anymore. That was criminal exposure. "Then he shouldn't have accepted the transfer," I said. "You're his sister, and he's my brother." The line went dead. The next morning, Daniel forwarded me a formal notice. Robert Gaines had withdrawn as legal counsel for Whitaker Restoration Group. That was not small. When lawyers step back, it's because risk outweighs loyalty. By Thursday, the probate court scheduled a preliminary hearing. 3 weeks from now, I stood in my Savannah office that afternoon, overlooking the historic district rooftops, and watched my team finalize a hotel design package. They didn't know the details of the family drama. They only knew I was focused. Revenge doesn't require rage. It requires discipline. That night, I reviewed the merger draft proposal again. Whitaker and Rowe, holding entity. Independent compliance officer. External audit requirements. Board rotation. Transparent compensation disclosures. If control shifted, I would implement structural reform immediately. No more centralized authority. No more family discretion. The next morning, I received a certified letter at my Charleston apartment from Thomas Whitaker. I opened it at the kitchen counter. Inside was a copy of a new will, his will. Effective immediately, I was removed as beneficiary. Everything allocated to Ethan. There it was. Punishment. Retaliation. A message. I read it twice. Then I folded it neatly and placed it beside the suspension letter. He thought inheritance was leverage. He still believed this was about money. It wasn't. It was about legitimacy. And in 3 weeks, under oath, in front of a judge, the structure he'd built on control would be tested. For the first time in my life, my father would have to answer questions he couldn't smooth over at a dinner table. And if the codicil fell, it wouldn't just restore my shares. It would expose everything underneath. 3 weeks. I've managed construction deadlines tighter than that. But this wasn't a hotel renovation. It was a foundation inspection, and the foundation was rotting. The Charleston County Probate Court building doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Red brick, white columns, fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look slightly exhausted. But that morning, it felt like a stage. The preliminary hearing on the estate of Margaret Hale was scheduled for 9:30 a.m., courtroom 3B. Judge Eleanor Watkins presiding. I had memorized every name. Before I walked inside, let me say something. If you've ever had to sit across from your own parents in a courtroom, if you've ever watched a family conflict turn into legal language, you understand how quiet the air feels. If this story resonates, stay with me. Like it. Comment. Subscribe if you want to see how it ends. Because this wasn't just family drama anymore. This was testimony. Thomas Whitaker arrived in a navy suit, jaw-tight posture rigid. Ethan Whitaker walked beside him, slightly behind eyes, scanning the hallway, like he was looking for exits. My mother, Judith Whitaker, trailed them, pale, clutching her handbag. Daniel Mercer stood next to me, reviewing notes, calm, focused. We're not arguing the full case today, he reminded me. This is about whether there's sufficient cause to proceed to trial. I understand, I said. Judge Watkins entered precisely on time. The court clerk read the case summary. Petition to contest codicil, allegations of undue influence, and lack of testamentary capacity. Daniel stood first. He spoke without theatrics. He referenced hospice medical records. He referenced surveillance logs. He referenced the discrepancy in witness presence. Then he called the hospice nurse. Under oath, she testified that Margaret Hale exhibited periods of confusion in the week leading up to the codicil's execution. Was she consistently oriented to time and circumstance? Daniel asked. No, the nurse answered. Across the room, my father didn't look at me. Next, Daniel presented evidence that Robert Gaines, listed as a witness, did not sign into the assisted living facility the day the codicil was allegedly executed. The judge's eyebrow lifted slightly. Then came the harder part. Ethan took the stand. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth. Daniel approached calmly. Mr. Whitaker, he began, 2 weeks after the codicil was executed, did you receive a transfer of $430,000 from Whitaker Restoration Group's reserves? Yes, Ethan said. For what purpose? Consulting services. Please describe those services. Ethan hesitated. Strategic expansion planning. Daniel didn't blink. Do you have documentation outlining this strategic plan? It was verbal. Do you have invoices? No. Board approval. My father authorized it. Daniel nodded. No further questions. Thomas Whitaker's attorney, new counsel, a litigator named Sandra Kell, cross-examined briefly, emphasizing family trust and long-term leadership grooming. But the damage wasn't in argument. It was in tone. Ethan sounded uncertain. Then my father took the stand. Thomas Whitaker, under oath, looked different. Not smaller, just less certain. Did you arrange the codicil signing? Sandra asked him. Yes. Did your mother express intent to transfer shares to Ethan? Yes. Daniel stood for cross-examination. Mr. Whitaker, he said evenly. Why was Lena Whitaker not informed of the amendment at the time? It was my mother's decision, Thomas replied. Was Lena excluded from visiting during that week? She was busy. With what? Thomas hesitated. Her other company. Daniel paused deliberately. Mr. Whitaker, are you aware that Margaret Hale's original will named Lena Whitaker as controlling shareholder? Yes. And you believed that decision required correction. I believed it required adjustment. Based on what? Continuity. Daniel let silence stretch. Continuity, for whom he asked. Thomas didn't answer immediately. The judge intervened. Answer the question. For the company, Thomas said finally. Daniel stepped back. No further questions. After closing statements, Judge Watkins leaned forward. I find sufficient grounds to proceed to full trial, she said. Given the evidence presented, this court orders temporary suspension of the codicil's authority, pending adjudication. There it was, temporary suspension. Control frozen. The gavel struck once. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. Family drama headlines write themselves. Thomas avoided cameras. Ethan kept his head down. I stood still, long enough for one reporter to ask Miss Whitaker, "Do you intend to reconcile?" "I intend to resolve," I said. By afternoon, Whitaker Restoration's board issued a statement, interim leadership structure under review. By evening, 2 more investors contacted me privately. Harold Benton called again. The board wants an emergency vote, he said. They're considering appointing you acting managing partner until trial resolution. I didn't answer immediately. If I stepped in now, it would look like ambition. If I refused, it would look weak. What are the terms I asked? Temporary oversight, full financial audit, external compliance review. That was exactly what I'd outlined in my merger proposal. Send me the draft, I said. At 8:47 p.m., my phone lit up again. Ethan. I let it ring twice before answering. You humiliated Dad, he said. He testified, I replied. You could have handled this privately. You had that option months ago. His voice dropped. If this goes to trial and the codicil is voided, the transfer gets scrutinized. I know. I can't repay $430,000. There it was. Not apology. Fear. What did you spend it on? I asked. Silence. Expansion research? He said weakly. BMW lease? I asked calmly. Condo deposit credit card balances. His breath sharpened. You think you're better than me, he said. No, I replied. I think I kept records. He hung up. I stood in my kitchen, looking out over the Ashley River. This wasn't revenge in the cinematic sense. It was structural correction. The next morning, the Whitaker Restoration Board voted 4-3. Thomas Whitaker was removed as interim chair pending trial. I was appointed acting managing partner under temporary court protection. The announcement went out at 10:15 a.m. By noon, I walked back into the Meeting Street headquarters. Amanda Collins stood when she saw me. Congratulations, she said quietly. I didn't smile. Schedule an all-staff meeting, I said. 30 minutes. At 12:30 p.m., I stood in the main conference room. 27 employees, designers, project managers, administrative staff. Some avoided my eyes. Some looked relieved. I won't pretend the last month hasn't been unstable, I began. Effective immediately, we're implementing external audit procedures and governance reform. All contracts remain active. Payroll remains intact. Operational continuity is the priority. Calm voice, clear directives, no mention of family. Afterward, I walked to my old office. The framed degree that had replaced mine was gone. My nameplate was back on the door. I didn't touch it. Instead, I sat at the desk and opened the first audit file. Because here's what people misunderstand about revenge. It's not about watching someone fall. It's about building something that can't be taken again. And this was only temporary authority. The full trial was still ahead. If the codicil was invalidated permanently, the fallout wouldn't just hit my father. It would trigger criminal review of that $430,000 transfer, which meant Ethan Whitaker wasn't just facing embarrassment. He was facing potential indictment, and the next hearing date had just been scheduled. 6 weeks from now, in front of a jury. The first thing I did as acting managing partner was lock down the books. Not symbolically, literally. I hired an external forensic accounting firm out of Atlanta Briggs and Calder Financial Review. 3 senior analysts, flat fee of $62,000 for a 6-week audit. I signed the contract myself. If you're going to take control in the middle of a family business war, you don't whisper, you formalize. By Monday morning, 2 analysts were seated in our main conference room on Meeting Street, laptops open, requesting 10 years of financial records, payroll, vendor contracts, executive compensation, loan covenants. Ethan didn't come into the office that day. Thomas did. He walked in at 9:12 a.m. unannounced, like he still owned the building. "Is this necessary?" he asked, standing in my doorway. "Yes," I said, without looking up from the report I was reviewing. "You're implying criminality. I'm implying transparency." His jaw tightened. "You've made your point?" "No," I said calmly. "The court made its point. I'm making mine." He stepped inside my office without invitation. "You think this is leadership, dragging our name through headlines? I think leadership means not forging estate documents." The words landed flat and clean. He inhaled slowly through his nose. That old habit, the one he used before raising his voice when we were kids. But he didn't raise it. "You've always needed to be right," he said quietly. "I need documentation," I corrected. He left without another word. By Wednesday, Briggs and Calder flagged irregularities beyond the $430,000 transfer. 2 undocumented consulting disbursements totaling $118,000 over the past 18 months. A personal vehicle lease charged partially to company expenses. Board minutes amended retroactively. Nothing explosive on its own. But patterns matter. At 4:00 p.m., Daniel Mercer called. "The district attorney's office has requested preliminary documentation," he said. "Based on what? Media exposure and probate filings. They're assessing whether there's prosecutable fraud." That shifted the air. Probate litigation is civil. Fraud investigation is criminal. "Has Ethan been contacted?" I asked. "Not yet, but if the audit confirms misappropriation, they will." I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment. This was the line I'd known might come. I wasn't seeking revenge in a dramatic way. I wasn't trying to destroy my brother, but accountability doesn't stop because it becomes uncomfortable. Thursday afternoon, Ethan finally showed up. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes. No bourbon confidence. "Can we talk?" he asked from the doorway. I nodded toward the chair across from me. He sat elbows on his knees. "Is the DA involved?" he asked. "Yes." His hands tightened. "Dad says you're pushing them." "I'm not pushing anyone. The court ordered review. You could stop it." I looked at him carefully. "Return the money," I said. "I can't." "Then it proceeds." He ran a hand through his hair. "I thought I'd fix it," he said quietly. The company was slowing down. I needed capital to pivot. "So you pivoted into personal debt?" I asked. His eyes flickered. "You don't understand the pressure," he said. I almost smiled. at the repetition. That's what Dad said. You were always the capable one, he said suddenly. Grandma favored you. Clients liked you. Investors called you directly. I had to compete with that. This wasn't an apology. It was an explanation. I never asked you to compete, I said. Dad did. There it was, the real dynamic. Thomas Whitaker didn't build leaders. He built rivals. Ethan stood. If I get charged, he said, this doesn't just hurt me. It hurts Mom. I held his gaze. It hurt Mom when the will was altered. He didn't respond. He walked out. That night, Judith Whitaker called. Her voice sounded older than 58. Ethan is scared, she said. He should be, I replied. You're his sister, and he's my brother. We had said those same words before. He says he thought you'd cover for him, she added quietly. That stopped me. Why would he think that? Because you always did. I didn't answer. Instead, I asked something else. Did you know about the $430,000 transfer? Silence. I knew money moved, she admitted, but not the amount. No, and you didn't question it. I trusted your father. That phrase again. Trust as surrender. The audit report, preliminary summary, arrived the following Monday. Briggs & Calder concluded that while company operations remained solvent, executive-level oversight lacked appropriate separation of duties. Specifically, Thomas Whitaker had unilateral authority over reserve disbursements without secondary approval. Translation: it was structurally easy to move money. The final line in the summary stood out. Evidence supports potential breach of fiduciary responsibility. Potential. Not definitive, but enough. 2 days later, a formal letter arrived from the Charleston County District Attorney's Office requesting cooperation. Voluntary production of documents. Daniel advised compliance. We don't obstruct, he said. We separate. Separate. By Thursday afternoon, local media picked up the story again. Whitaker Restoration under financial review amid estate dispute. Family business. Inheritance. Possible fraud. All the keywords lined up neatly for public consumption. At 5:15 p.m., the board convened an emergency virtual session. 7 members. 4 in favor of maintaining my temporary authority. 3 still loyal to Thomas. The deciding vote came from Margaret Hale's old friend Carolyn Brooks, 78 years old, silent for weeks. She cleared her throat on the call. I trusted Margaret's instincts, Caroline said. She believed in Lena. I believe in Lena. That was it. Temporary authority extended through trial. Thomas Whitaker's access to company accounts was formally revoked. When the meeting ended, I closed my laptop slowly. This wasn't loud revenge. It was controlled correction. But that night, something shifted again. At 9:02 p.m., Daniel called. The DA has scheduled interviews, he said. Ethan first, then Thomas. Timeline. Within 10 days. I leaned back in my chair. And if Ethan cooperates, he may negotiate, Daniel said carefully. Reduced exposure in exchange for testimony. Testimony. Against our father. I didn't speak for a moment. You didn't start this, Daniel said quietly. I know, I replied, but starting and finishing are different things. 2 days later, I received an email from an unknown sender. Subject: you should see this. Attached was a scanned document. A life insurance policy update dated 3 months before my grandmother's death. Primary beneficiary, Ethan Whitaker. Policy owner, Margaret Hale. Signature looks shaky. Witness Thomas Whitaker. I stared at it. Another amendment, another shift, another quiet adjustment made when she was ill. This wasn't about one codicil. It was a pattern. And patterns, once exposed, don't disappear quietly. The trial date was now officially set. 4 weeks from today. Jury selection. Public testimony. Under oath. Everything on record. I closed the document and forwarded it to Daniel with one sentence. Add this to the file, because if we were going to inspect the foundation, we weren't stopping at one crack. The life insurance policy changed the temperature of everything. Until that email, the case centered on one codicil, one altered document, one transfer of control. Now, there were 2 instruments amended within weeks of my grandmother, Margaret Hale's death. 2 shifts, same beneficiary, same witness. Pattern. Daniel Mercer called within 20 minutes of receiving the document. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "Anonymous email," I said. "No return trail I can identify." "We'll trace it." "Does it matter?" I asked. "It matters if someone inside is cooperating." Cooperating. That word meant someone close to my father had decided distance was safer than loyalty. Daniel's voice shifted into strategy mode. If this policy was amended under similar circumstances, it strengthens the undue influence argument significantly. But more importantly, it supports prosecutorial interest. And if the DA sees a pattern, I asked. "They don't like patterns," he said. "They call them schemes." Schemes. That night, I couldn't ignore the weight of it. The codicil could be argued as emotional favoritism. A dying mother adjusting control. Messy, but arguable. 2 documents. Same beneficiary, same timing. That becomes intention. The next morning, I called the insurance company listed on the policy, Hale Mutual Life. Corporate office in Columbia. I didn't announce litigation. I asked for confirmation of amendment dates and witness logs. They wouldn't release full details without subpoena. But the representative confirmed something small. Yes, the beneficiary change was processed in-house after documentation was submitted by Thomas Whitaker. Submitted by, not executed in office. That meant the paperwork wasn't signed in front of insurance staff. It was mailed or delivered. Like the codicil, later that afternoon, Daniel confirmed what I already suspected. The signature on the insurance amendment doesn't match prior specimens cleanly, he said. "We're bringing in a forensic document examiner." My father had built his reputation on precision, clean lines, historic preservation, respect for original structure. Now his own signatures were under structural review. At 6:00 p.m., I drove to my mother's new apartment in West Ashley. She'd moved quietly after the board vote. Small 2-bedroom rental, neutral carpeting, no antiques, no Whitaker portraits on the walls. Judith opened the door slowly. She looked tired. "Why are you here?" she asked. I stepped inside without waiting for invitation. "Did you know about the life insurance amendment?" I asked. She sat down heavily at the small dining table. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Did Grandma discuss it with you?" She said she wanted Ethan protected. "From what?" She didn't answer. "From Dad," I pressed. Judith's hands trembled slightly. "Your father told her the company would fracture if control was split," she said. "He told her investors wouldn't trust a divided leadership structure." "That's not true," I said. "I know that now." Did she understand what she was signing? Judith looked up at me, eyes wet but steady. "I don't know." It was the first honest answer I'd gotten in weeks. "Did you see her sign it?" I asked. "No," she whispered. "Your father brought the papers afterward." Afterward, I stood up slowly. "Mom," I said carefully, "if this goes to trial and you're subpoenaed, you'll have to testify." "I know. And if you lie, I won't," she said almost sharply. That surprised me. For 30 years, Judith Whitaker had chosen silence over confrontation. Now something had shifted. "Your father doesn't sleep," she added quietly. "He walks the house at night." Good, I thought. Pressure clarifies. 3 days later, the forensic document examiner delivered a preliminary report. Signature inconsistencies noted. Stroke variation, inconsistent with prior legal signatures. Potential evidence of guided hand. Guided hand. I closed my eyes for a second. Morphine. Weakness. A pen placed in her fingers. Or worse. Daniel didn't soften it. "If this holds up under scrutiny," he said, "it's forgery." Forgery carries weight, not civil dispute weight, felony weight. That afternoon, I received a certified letter from Thomas Whitaker's attorney, Sandra Kell. Proposal for settlement discussion. I read it twice. Terms suggested. Probate petition withdrawn. Control restored to Ethan. In exchange, a financial payout, to me equivalent to estimated share value. Money instead of authority. Hush instead of trial. Classic. I called Daniel. They're scared, he said simply. What's your recommendation? If you accept money, the criminal angle likely evaporates. Prosecutors lose leverage without cooperating witnesses. And if I refuse, full trial, full exposure. I thought about my grandmother, Margaret Hale, climbing scaffolding at 63. I thought about the original will she'd shown me, her voice, steady. I didn't fight for cash. I fought for structure. Draft a counter, I said. Full admission of invalid codicil, public correction, immediate resignation of Thomas and Ethan from fiduciary positions. Daniel was quiet for a moment. They won't accept that. I know. The following evening, Ethan showed up at my Savannah office, unannounced. He looked worse than before. Dad won't admit anything, he said. I didn't expect him to. He says you're trying to destroy him. I'm correcting what he did. You're going to put him in prison if he committed a crime that's not on me. Ethan paced the office. I can testify, he said suddenly. I watched him carefully. Testify to what? That he pressured Grandma. That he told me it was handled legally. That I didn't understand the details. There it was. Self-preservation. Why now, I asked. He stopped pacing. Because if this becomes criminal, they'll charge me too. Honesty, finally. I didn't forge anything, he added. I just accepted what Dad put in front of me. Acceptance doesn't erase liability. You want me to protect you, I said. I want you to consider that we were both manipulated. That word hung in the air. Manipulation. Had Thomas Whitaker built this entire structure to pit us against each other? Maybe. But Ethan wasn't innocent. You benefited, I said calmly. Yes, he admitted. We stood there in silence. If you cooperate with the DA, I said you cooperate fully. No half-truths. And you, I continue with the probate case. His shoulders dropped slightly. Dad will never forgive either of us. I'm not asking for forgiveness. He nodded once and left. The next week, subpoenas were formally issued. Thomas Whitaker, Ethan Whitaker, Robert Gaines, Cynthia Moore, and Judith Whitaker. Trial date confirmed. Jury pool summoned. Local press intensified coverage. Family business. Inheritance dispute. Alleged forgery. Everything my father had built his image around control authority reputation was now subject to cross-examination. 3 nights before jury selection, Thomas Whitaker finally called me directly. No intermediaries, no attorneys, just his voice. You don't understand what this will do, he said quietly. I do, I replied. It will stain our name. It already is. You could still stop this. Admit the codicil is invalid, I said. Silence. And the policy, I added. Longer silence. I was protecting the company, he said. From me, I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he said something softer. You were always too independent. There it was, the real offense. Not incompetence, not incapacity. Independence. I learned that from Grandma, I said. He exhaled slowly. If this goes forward, he said, I won't negotiate again. I'm not negotiating, I replied. We ended the call without goodbye. The night before jury selection, I sat in my Charleston apartment, reviewing deposition transcripts. Not because I doubted the case, because I wanted clarity. Revenge and family drama isn't about shouting. It's about staying still while the other side unravels. And tomorrow, under oath, with a jury watching, the unraveling would begin. What I didn't know yet was that someone else had decided not to wait for the courtroom. Because at 6:12 a.m., before I even left for court, my phone lit up with a breaking news alert. Whitaker Restoration Group under criminal investigation. The DA had gone public, and the investigation wasn't limited to documents. It included alleged financial misrepresentation tied to bank covenants, which meant this wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about the survival of the entire company. The headline hit before sunrise. Whitaker Restoration Group under criminal investigation. Not probate dispute, not inheritance conflict, criminal investigation. By 6:30 a.m., 3 investors had called. By 7:00, our bank relationship manager left a voicemail requesting an urgent review of compliance exposure. By 7:12, the Charleston Ledger had pushed a notification to every business subscriber in the state. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the screen. This was no longer a family drama contained in a courtroom. This was a liquidity event. At 8:15 a.m., I walked into headquarters on Meeting Street and called an emergency executive session. CFO Mark Delgado, who had served under my father for 12 years, looked pale. "What exactly is the DA investigating?" he asked. "Forgery, potential misappropriation, and possible misrepresentation tied to covenant disclosures," I said calmly. The last part landed heavily. Our primary operating line of credit with Atlantic Regional Bank required accurate executive disclosure and financial reporting. If the bank determined material misrepresentation, they could call the loan. $4.8 million outstanding. 37 active projects mid-cycle. I turned to Mark. "Are the covenant reports clean?" He hesitated. "Define clean." I held his gaze. "Accurate, complete, no omissions." He exhaled slowly. Thomas signed off on final certifications. I reviewed numbers, but not disclosures tied to estate matters. Estate matters weren't technically required in covenant reports unless they affected governance control, which they did. At 9:40 a.m., Atlantic Regional's legal counsel requested an emergency video conference. By 10:15, I was staring at 3 bankers on screen. Miss Whitaker, the senior VP, began. "Given public criminal investigation, we need assurance that executive leadership is stable and no misrepresentation occurred in prior certifications." "It did not," I said clearly. "Financial statements remain accurate. The investigation pertains to estate documentation and discretionary disbursement oversight." Was the $430,000 transfer disclosed as executive compensation? It was coded as consulting expense. And was that classification accurate? I paused. "Not fully," I said. Silence. "Then we have a material governance concern," the VP replied. "I am implementing external audit and fiduciary reform immediately," I said. "Thomas Whitaker no longer has access to company accounts. Ethan Whitaker has no signing authority. We are fully cooperating with the DA." They exchanged glances. "We will temporarily freeze additional credit extension pending review," the VP said. "But we are not calling the line at this time." "Not yet." After the call ended, I looked around the conference room. 22 employees were counting on payroll next Friday. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about survival. At noon, the DA's office confirmed formal inquiry into potential forgery and financial misconduct. Thomas Whitaker was scheduled for voluntary interview. Ethan Whitaker had already retained separate counsel. The separation had begun. At 2:00 p.m., I received a text from Ethan. "Dad thinks you tipped off the DA." I didn't reply. At 4:30 p.m., Harold Benton called again. "Liquidity risk?" he asked directly. "Contained for now," I said. "If the bank calls the line, I have bridge financing lined up through Whitaker and Rowe," I said. That part was true. My independent firm had $3.2 million in retained earnings and access to a separate credit facility. I could stabilize payroll for 90 days if necessary. Harold was quiet for a moment. "You're thinking like Margaret," he said. "That's the goal." That night, Thomas Whitaker showed up at my apartment. No warning, no appointment. I opened the door and saw a man who looked older than 59. "This is out of control," he said. "You lost control," I corrected. "You involve prosecutors." I filed a probate petition. "You knew it would escalate." I knew it would be reviewed. He stepped inside without waiting. "You're risking the company your grandmother built." "No," I said calmly. "You did that when you altered her will." He stared at me. "I was protecting the business from fragmentation," he said. "Investors don't trust divided authority. They don't trust forgery either." His jaw tightened. "I needed one decisive successor." "You had one." He didn't respond. Instead, he shifted tactics. If the bank pulls funding, projects stall. Layoffs follow. Is that what you want? There it was, the moral pressure pivot. You think I didn't prepare for that? I asked. His eyes flickered slightly. You don't have that kind of capital, he said. Whitaker and Rowe does. Silence. That landed harder than anything else. He had underestimated my independence for years. You'd merge, he asked, if necessary. You'd erase the Whitaker name. No, I said. I'd restructure it. He looked around my apartment. Minimalist, clean lines. No family photos. You've been planning this, he said quietly. I've been building options. That was the difference between us. He relied on authority. I relied on contingency. 2 days later, the DA's office requested formal financial documentation from Atlantic Regional Bank. The story escalated again. Family business under criminal scrutiny amid inheritance dispute. Employees started whispering. I called an all-hands meeting. I won't discuss ongoing legal matters, I said clearly, but I will address stability. Payroll is secure. Contracts remain active. No layoffs. I watched shoulders drop slightly. Leadership isn't loud. It's measured. After the meeting, Mark Delgado pulled me aside. There's something else, he said quietly. What? He handed me a folder. Internal emails. Thomas Whitaker had directed Mark 18 months earlier to reclassify certain executive draws as consulting allocations to streamline optics. Optics. I closed the folder slowly. Was this disclosed to the board, I asked? No. Was it legal? It's aggressive. Aggressive isn't illegal, but it invites scrutiny. The pattern was growing. That night, Daniel called again. The DA is considering offering Ethan limited immunity in exchange for testimony, he said. And he's leaning toward accepting. That meant Ethan would likely testify that Thomas orchestrated document amendments and authorized transfers. Fathers don't recover from that easily. 3 days before the formal criminal review hearing, Atlantic Regional issued a conditional notice. If executive misconduct materially impaired financial reporting, they reserved the right to demand immediate repayment. It was a warning shot. At 7:18 p.m., my mother called. Your father won't cooperate, she said. He'll have to, I replied. He says if he goes down, he's taking the company with him. I stared out at the harbor lights. He doesn't have that power anymore, I said. She was quiet. He never believed you'd push this far, she whispered. I didn't either. That was the truth. I hadn't planned for criminal exposure. I had planned for structural correction. But when you pull at a thread in a toxic family system, you don't get to choose how much unravels. The morning of the DA's formal review session, I arrived at the courthouse early, not as a defendant, as a cooperating corporate officer. Thomas Whitaker arrived 15 minutes later. He didn't look at me. Ethan arrived separately. He didn't look at either of us. Inside, prosecutors outlined investigative scope: forgery, misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty. They weren't making accusations publicly yet, but they were building a case. After 2 hours of review, the lead prosecutor said something that shifted everything. If sufficient evidence supports intentional misrepresentation tied to loan covenants, this extends beyond estate fraud. Extended beyond. That meant the bank exposure wasn't hypothetical. It was part of the investigation. As we walked out of the courthouse, Thomas finally looked at me. This is your revenge, he said quietly. No, I replied. This is your accountability. He didn't answer. That evening, Atlantic Regional Bank sent a second notice. Pending investigation outcome. Executive leadership change must be permanent to maintain credit line. Permanent. Not temporary suspension, not interim oversight. Permanent removal of Thomas Whitaker from fiduciary authority. The board convened again. Emergency vote. 6-1. Thomas Whitaker was formally removed as executive officer. Not just pending trial. Immediately. Ethan resigned that same night. By 11:47 p.m., I was officially sole managing partner of Whitaker Restoration Group. No codicil required. No inheritance transfer, Just board vote under pressure. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I'd been excluded. Now the tables had turned completely. But control came with risk. If the criminal case proceeded and financial misrepresentation was proven, the Whitaker name could collapse entirely. And if that happened, I would be the one holding the company when it fell. Because revenge in real life isn't cinematic. It's responsibility. And tomorrow, I had to decide something no judge could decide for me. Whether to merge Whitaker Restoration into my independent firm before the verdict, or let the name stand alone and take the impact. Either way, the foundation was about to be tested. 3 days after my father was permanently removed as executive officer, I stood alone in the Whitaker Restoration boardroom at 6:10 a.m. Sunlight hadn't reached the windows yet. The brass letters on the wall still read, Whitaker Restoration Group. Same font, same weight, same name my grandmother, Margaret Hale, had built into something respected. And now that name was under criminal review. Before I tell you what I decided that morning, let me say this. If you've ever had to choose between protecting a legacy and protecting yourself, you know how quiet that kind of decision feels. If you're still here, stay with me. Like, comment, subscribe. Because this is where the tables really turned. At 8:00 a.m., the board convened. 7 members, 1 empty chair where Thomas Whitaker used to sit. Harold Benton cleared his throat first. The bank requires permanent structural reform, he said. The criminal investigation remains active. We must consider risk insulation. Risk insulation, corporate language for survival. Caroline Brooks spoke next. The Whitaker name is now attached to fraud allegations. Whether proven or not, perception affects contracts. She wasn't wrong. 2 hospitality clients had already paused negotiations pending clarity. A municipal courthouse restoration bid was under reconsideration. Optics mattered. I stood and placed a single document on the table. Proposed resolution, formation of Hale Architectural Holdings. Not Whitaker, Hale, my grandmother's maiden name. The structure was clean. Whitaker Restoration Group absorbed into a new parent entity. Full board rotation. Independent compliance oversight. Executive signatory separation. Public disclosure statement acknowledging governance failure without admission of criminal guilt. Harold looked at me carefully. You'd retire the Whitaker name, yes? Silence. Temporarily, someone asked. No. That landed heavier than I expected. I continued calmly. The name is compromised. Clients need clarity. Investors need insulation. The work continues, but under a structure built for transparency. And your father, one board member asked. He no longer holds fiduciary authority. That's not what I meant. I held his gaze. I'm not building a company around a surname, I said. I'm building one around standards. The vote was called. 6 in favor, 1 abstention. Hale Architectural Holdings was approved. By 10:47 a.m., the brass letters on the wall were scheduled for removal. At 12:15 p.m., I signed the restructuring documents. At 2:30 p.m., a public statement was drafted. At 4:00 p.m., Thomas Whitaker called. They told me, he said flatly. Yes, you erased our name. I protected the company. You replaced me. You removed yourself. His breathing was slow, controlled. Margaret would never have allowed this. I let that sit. She signed the original will, leaving me control, I said. You amended it. Silence. You think this is karma, he asked. I think this is consequence. He hung up. At 6:20 p.m., Ethan texted. Heard about the name change. I didn't reply. 2 days later, the DA's office announced formal charges. Forgery in the 2nd degree. Breach of fiduciary duty. Financial misrepresentation under review. Thomas Whitaker was indicted. Ethan was not. He had agreed to testify. Family betrayal isn't loud when it happens. It's paperwork. My mother called that night. They're arraigning him next week, she said. I know. He looks smaller, she whispered. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because feeling and action are different. The arraignment was brief. Thomas Whitaker stood in front of a judge and entered a plea of not guilty. His attorney argued procedural overreach. Bond conditions set. Travel restrictions imposed. The media cameras flashed. The name Whitaker trended locally for 3 days. And every time it did, Hale, Architectural Holdings, remained separate in headlines. That was intentional. I had insulated the structure before the collapse. But there was one more layer. Atlantic Regional Bank required written affirmation that no executive under investigation retained indirect control, which meant something specific. I needed written confirmation that Thomas Whitaker had no shadow authority through side agreements, silent shares, or unrecorded promissory notes. I called Mark Delgado. Pull every historical shareholder side letter, I said. He did, and that's when we found it. A memorandum of understanding dated 8 years ago, unrecorded, signed only by Thomas Whitaker and Robert Gaines. Clause granting Thomas veto power over majority shareholder decisions in extraordinary circumstances. Even if he didn't hold majority shares. Extraordinary circumstances. Undefined. The clause had never been disclosed to the board, never activated, but it existed. A hidden lever. If the codicil had stood and I'd gained control later, he still would have retained override power. He had never intended to relinquish control. Not to me, not to anyone. I forwarded the document to Daniel. Is this enforceable? I asked. Unlikely, he said. Undisclosed side agreements tied to fiduciary structure. It's weak, but it shows intent, I said. Yes, intent. Pattern. Control at all costs. The DA added the memorandum to their investigative file. 3 weeks later, under mounting evidence and potential expansion of charges, Thomas Whitaker's attorney approached Daniel with a proposal. Plea negotiation. Reduce charges in exchange for admission of improper influence and restitution of misclassified funds. Restitution. The $430,000 plus penalties. The board required my approval for any settlement tied to corporate exposure. I reviewed the terms carefully. No prison time recommended. Probation. Financial penalties. Permanent prohibition from holding fiduciary office in the state. Permanent. I signed the board consent, not because I wanted leniency, because stability mattered more than spectacle. When the plea was entered, Thomas Whitaker stood again in front of a judge. This time, he admitted to exerting undue influence in altering estate documentation and misclassifying executive disbursements. No dramatic confession, no emotional speech, just legal admission. The Whitaker name in court records became permanent. Hale, Architectural Holdings, moved forward, unaffected. 1 week later, the brass letters were physically removed from the building. I watched from the sidewalk as workers unscrewed each one. Whitaker. The wall underneath was lighter, where the letters had shielded it from sun. History leaves marks, even when removed. Harold stood beside me. You feel victorious, he asked. No, I said. Regret. No. What then? Correct. That was the word. Not revenge. Not triumph. Correction. That evening, my mother came to the office for the first time since the arraignment. She walked through the lobby, slowly reading the new name on the glass. Hale, Architectural Holdings. She would have liked that, she said quietly. Yes, I replied. Judith looked at me. Your father says you destroyed him. I didn't force him to sign anything. She nodded slowly. I know. For the first time in years, she didn't defend him. As she left, she paused near the elevator. You didn't choose revenge, she said softly. You chose structure. That night, I sat alone in the boardroom. The company was stable, payroll secured, clients returning, criminal exposure contained, my father on probation, my brother rebuilding his life outside the company, the toxic family hierarchy dismantled. But something else was shifting, because next month would mark 1 year since my grandmother, Margaret Hale's death. And there was one final document in her estate file I hadn't opened, a sealed letter addressed only to me. Release authorized upon resolution of estate litigation. Daniel had mentioned it once, I hadn't asked for it yet. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because I'd been focused on survival. Maybe because I didn't want more truth. But sitting there, under the new name on the wall, I realized something. Correction is structural. Closure is personal. And tomorrow, I was going to open that letter. I waited a full year before asking for it. Daniel Mercer had mentioned the sealed letter early in the probate process, almost in passing. There's a personal document to be released upon final resolution, he'd said. At the time, I had been fighting for control, restructuring debt exposure, preparing for trial. I didn't have space for sentiment. Now the estate litigation was closed. The codicil had been invalidated. The criminal case had ended with a plea. Hale Architectural Holdings was stable. The Whitaker name no longer controlled anything. So I called Daniel. "I'm ready for the letter," I said. He didn't ask if I was sure. "Come by at 4, he replied. His office looked the same as it had the first day I walked in, with 2 competing wills. Same dark wood shelves, same quiet hum of HVAC, same brass desk lamp. He handed me a cream envelope, slightly yellowed at the edges. Margaret Hale's handwriting was precise, even at the end. For Lena. Daniel stepped out without commentary. I sat alone and opened it carefully. The paper inside was folded once. "Lena, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong." That was the first line. Not sentimental, not dramatic. Margaret never wasted words. I folded the page open fully. "I have always known your father would struggle with control. He learned business under me, but not temperament. Authority came easily to him. Letting go never did." My chest tightened slightly. "If there has been conflict over the company, know this. I left it to you because you understand systems, not because you are my granddaughter. You question structure. You document. You don't assume loyalty equals competence." I read that line twice. I did not exclude Ethan because I disliked him. I excluded him because he seeks approval before responsibility. That makes him vulnerable to influence. I exhaled slowly. If Thomas altered my wishes, it will not surprise me. He believes consolidation prevents collapse. Sometimes it causes it. There was no anger in her handwriting, just clarity. "Do not fight for the company if it costs you your independence. The business can be rebuilt. Character cannot." That line settled into me differently than the rest. The final paragraph was shorter. "You were never second in my mind. You were prepared. If this letter is necessary, it means you needed confirmation more than inheritance. Love, Margaret Hale." No flourish, no apology, just confirmation. I sat in Daniel's office for a long time after finishing it. Not crying, not shaking, just still. Confirmation more than inheritance. That was the truth of it. The money, the shares, the title. Those had never been the deepest cut. The cut had been doubt. Was I overlooked because I wasn't capable, or because I wasn't compliant? Margaret had answered that question before I even asked it. When I stepped back into the hallway, Daniel looked up from his desk. "Closure," he asked. "Clarity," I replied. He nodded once. "Your father's probation terms were finalized this morning," he added. 3 years, financial penalties paid. No corporate fiduciary authority permitted. I absorbed that quietly. "And Ethan," I asked. "Testified fully, no charges filed. He's out." Out! The words sounded different now. That evening, I drove to the Queen Street house. The old mansion looked smaller than I remembered. Paint on the shutters peeling slightly. Porch lights dimmer. Thomas Whitaker opened the door himself. He looked older than 59 now. Probation agreements age people quickly. "I'm not here to argue," I said. He stepped aside without speaking. The house felt hollow, less polished, less curated. We stood in the dining room, where my grandmother once spread blueprints across the table. "I read her letter," I said. He didn't ask what it said. "She expected this," I continued. His jaw tightened slightly. "She expected you to struggle with control." He didn't deny it. "You think you're vindicated," he said. "I think I was prepared." Silence settled between us. She left the company to you, he said finally. I thought it was a mistake. I know. I built that company. After her, he added. I expanded it. And then you altered her will. He exhaled slowly. I thought Ethan needed it more. Needed approval, I asked. He didn't answer. You were afraid of fragmentation, I continued. But consolidation without integrity fractures faster. He looked at me then. Really looked. You don't sound angry, he said. I'm not. That seemed to unsettle him, more than accusation would have. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he added. I'm not offering absolution. That wasn't cruelty. It was boundary. We stood there another minute in silence. Then I said the only thing that mattered. I renamed the company Hale for a reason. His eyes flickered. I'm aware. She built it. You expanded it. I stabilized it. He nodded slowly. That's your version, he said. It's documented, I replied. He almost smiled at that. Almost. As I left, he said something unexpected. You always were the structural one. It wasn't praise, but it wasn't dismissal either. That night, I drove back to my apartment, overlooking the harbor. The letter sat on the passenger seat beside me. Confirmation more than inheritance. I placed it in my desk drawer next to the final audit report and the plea agreement summary. Different documents, same theme. Control without accountability collapses. 3 weeks later, Hale Architectural Holdings secured a new contract, a historic courthouse restoration in Beaufort, valued at $9.6 million. The client cited governance transparency as a deciding factor. Transparency, the thing my father had once considered weakness. Harold Benton came by the office that afternoon. You could have taken the payout months ago, he said. Yes. Why didn't you? Because money wouldn't have corrected the structure. He nodded. You're not fighting anymore. No, I said. I'm building. There was one more thing to do, one more quiet adjustment. At the next board meeting, I proposed an amendment to our corporate charter, automatic dual signatory requirement for all executive disbursements above $50,000. Mandatory independent audit every fiscal year. Public governance transparency statement posted online. The board approved unanimously. No silent clauses, no hidden memorandums, no extraordinary circumstances undefined. When the meeting ended, I stayed behind alone in the boardroom again. The Hale name on the wall felt steady, not triumphant, just stable. And that's when I realized something else. The revenge part of this story had ended weeks ago. What remained wasn't drama. It was distance. Distance from manipulation. Distance from favoritism. Distance from a structure that required silence to function. But distance creates space. And in that space, something unexpected had started to surface. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something quieter, which meant the final chapter wasn't about my father, or my brother, or even the company. It was about me, and the boundaries I was finally ready to draw, without litigation forcing them. The courthouse gave me authority. The boardroom gave me control. But neither one taught me how to sit across from my own family without defaulting to performance. 3 months after Hale Architectural Holdings secured the Beaufort courthouse contract, my mother invited me to dinner. Not Thanksgiving dinner, not Christmas, just Tuesday, at her apartment in West Ashley. It felt different immediately. No long dining table polished for guests. No portraits watching from walls. No carefully curated silverware. Just a small oak table for two. Judith had made salmon and roasted vegetables. Simple, measured. We sat down without ceremony. How's work, she asked. Stable, I replied. That word had become important. Stable meant no crisis, no hidden clauses, no forged documents. I saw the Hale sign on the building, she said quietly. It suits you. It suits the structure, I corrected. She smiled faintly. You sound like your grandmother. That's intentional. We ate in silence for a few minutes. Then she set her fork down. I'm seeing someone, she said. That wasn't the direction I expected. Oh, I asked. His name is Richard Coleman. He's an accountant. Divorced. 2 grown children. I nodded. You deserve something separate, I said. She looked at me carefully. I didn't know I could have separate, she admitted. That landed harder than I expected. For 30 years, she had existed inside a system where silence equaled stability. Now she was building her own. You did what you had to, she said after a moment. No, I replied. I did what I chose. She absorbed that quietly. Your father still says you escalated it, she added. He escalated it when he signed for her, I said calmly. She didn't argue. That was new. After dinner, she walked me to the door. I don't expect holidays, she said softly. I don't expect everything to go back. It won't, I said. She nodded. But I'd like something different. Different is possible, I said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was boundary. 2 weeks later, Ethan asked to meet. Not at the old house, at a coffee shop near King Street. He looked steadier than he had during the investigation. Less frantic, less defensive. I'm working at a construction supply firm, he said. Sales. I nodded. How's that? Less pressure, he admitted. Clear commission. Clear expectations. Clear. That word again. I'm not here to ask for anything, he said. That's good. He smiled slightly at that. I wanted to say something. Without lawyers in the room, he continued. I should have questioned Dad sooner. Yes, I didn't. No, he didn't argue. I was raised to compete with you, he said quietly. I didn't know how not to. I wasn't competing, I replied. I know that now. We sat in silence for a moment. I don't expect to be involved in the company again, he said. You won't be. That wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. I figured, he said. He stood after a few more minutes. For what it's worth, he added, you didn't destroy the family. It was already fractured. That was the closest thing to honesty we'd had in years. When he left, I felt something surprising. Not anger, not vindication, relief. Boundaries without litigation. No courtroom, no judge, just terms understood. Back at the office, Hale Architectural Holdings had grown to 31 employees. Revenue up 12% quarter over quarter. Independent audit completed cleanly. Atlantic Regional restored full credit extension. Governance reforms posted publicly. Investors satisfied. One afternoon, Harold Benton stopped by again. You've stabilized faster than expected, he said. I planned for contraction, I replied. You planned for collapse, he corrected. Yes, he studied me carefully. You could expand aggressively now. Acquisition, new markets. I won't. He raised an eyebrow. Why not? Because expansion without discipline recreates the same pressure that caused this. He smiled faintly. Margaret would approve. I know. That evening, I walked through the building alone. The Hale name on the glass reflected city lights. Inside, framed project photos lined the hallway. No Whitaker portraits, no family plaques, just work. And then I did something small, but deliberate. I removed the last framed article from the Charleston Ledger that mentioned the investigation. It had been in my office drawer. I didn't need it anymore. Revenge stories are addictive. Family drama draws attention. But attention isn't structure. It's noise. 3 weeks later, I received a handwritten note in the mail. From Thomas Whitaker, no return address. I opened it slowly. Lena, I won't pretend I agree with how you handled this, but I acknowledge that you handled it. The company is stable. You were prepared. That's all he wrote. No apology. No reconciliation. Just acknowledgement. For years, I had wanted him to say I was capable. Now that he had it, felt quiet. Not triumphant, just factual. I folded the note and placed it in the same drawer as Margaret's letter. Different tone, same clarity. That night, I stood in my apartment, overlooking the harbor again. 1 year earlier, I had stood in the same place, watching my father erase my name in front of 83 guests. Now I was standing alone in a space that required no approval, no audience, no applause. The toxic hierarchy was gone. The favoritism dismantled. The manipulation exposed. The company corrected. But here's what I understood for the first time. The real shift wasn't in court. It wasn't in the board vote. It wasn't in the name change. It was internal. I no longer needed to prove I belonged at the table. I built my own, and that meant the final chapter wasn't about what I took back. It was about what I refused to carry forward. Because legacy isn't inherited, it's chosen. And I was done choosing systems that required me to shrink. Tomorrow, I would walk into the office like any other day. No headlines, no hearings, no emergency calls, just structure. And that finally was enough. 1 year and 3 months after my father stood in a ballroom and reassigned my inheritance, I hosted something at the Charleston Maritime Club. Not an engagement party, not a shareholder power move, a governance forum, open invitation, clients, investors, local business owners, 48 confirmed attendees. The topic was simple: ethical oversight in family-owned companies. The irony wasn't subtle, but it wasn't theatrical either. I didn't host it for revenge. I hosted it because I understood something now that I hadn't understood before. Toxic family systems don't stay inside houses. They leak into boardrooms. They disguise control as protection. They call favoritism strategy. They label manipulation as loyalty. And if nobody names it, it repeats. Before I stepped up to speak that night, I paused backstage for a second. If you've been following this story, from the first moment my name was erased, you know, this wasn't about inheritance alone. It was about identity, about being excluded quietly, about choosing structure over silence. If that resonates with you, if you've ever had to draw a boundary that cost you comfort, stay with this. Share it, because someone out there is still sitting at their own version of that table. When I walked onto the stage, there was no applause yet, just attention. I didn't mention Thomas Whitaker. I didn't mention Ethan. I didn't mention criminal charges or forged documents. I talked about governance frameworks. I talked about dual signatory requirements. I talked about separating family emotion from fiduciary responsibility. I talked about how inheritance without oversight creates risk. Family businesses fail for predictable reasons, I said evenly. Lack of documentation, concentrated authority, avoidance of conflict. Silence mistaken for stability. People took notes. I could see it. I wasn't telling a revenge story. I was explaining a system failure. Afterward, during the reception, a woman in her late 50s approached me. "My daughter works for our company," she said. "My husband always says she's emotional. I think she's just prepared." I held her gaze. "Preparation looks threatening when control is the priority," I said. She nodded slowly. That's what this had become. Not payback, perspective. Later that week, Hale Architectural Holdings finalized its annual audit. Clean, no flags, no exceptions. The external compliance officer signed off without comment. Atlantic Regional renewed our credit facility for 3 years. Harold Benton formally retired from the board and asked me to replace him as chair. I declined. "I prefer separation of authority," I said. He smiled. "You really did learn." "Yes." That weekend, my mother invited me over again. This time, Richard Coleman was there. He shook my hand, polite, measured, no posturing. We ate at the same small oak table. No tension, no performance. Halfway through dinner, my mother said something that surprised me. "I saw your father last week," she said. I looked up. "He asked about you, and he said the company looks stable." I nodded. "That's good." She studied my face. "You don't feel anything." "I feel aligned," I said. That was the truth. Alignment is different from victory. Victory implies opposition. Alignment implies clarity. A month later, I ran into Ethan at a construction expo in Savannah. He was working a booth for the supply firm. When he saw me, he didn't tense. He didn't perform. "How's Hale?" he asked. "Steady," I replied. He nodded. "I'm studying for my contractor licensing exam," he said. "That's good. I should have done that years ago." "Yes." He laughed lightly. "No hard feelings?" he asked. "Boundaries," I said. He nodded. That was enough. On the anniversary of my grandmother, Margaret Hale's death, I visited the Beaufort Courthouse site. The restoration was nearing completion. Stone cleaned, windows restored, structural reinforcement invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. I stood inside the main hall and ran my hand lightly over a newly finished column. From the outside, it looked historic. From the inside, it had been rebuilt. That's what most people don't understand about revenge in real life. It's not about burning down the house. It's about reinforcing it so it can't be altered quietly again. Later that afternoon, I opened my desk drawer. Inside were 3 documents: Margaret's letter, Thomas's acknowledgement, the final audit report. I didn't need to read them again. They weren't trophies. They were reminders. The real betrayal hadn't been the altered will. It had been the expectation that I would accept exclusion to keep the peace. The real injustice hadn't been losing control. It had been being told I wasn't suited for it. The real revenge hadn't been watching my father stand in court. It had been watching the company stabilize under a structure he never believed I could build. And the real lesson: boundaries don't destroy families. Silence does. I locked the drawer and stood up. Outside my office window, Charleston moved the way it always had. Boats in the harbor, traffic on East Bay, tourists walking past buildings that had stood for centuries because someone reinforced their foundations instead of pretending cracks weren't there. I am 32 now. I run a company with 38 employees. We close projects on schedule. We publish governance reports publicly. We require oversight, not because we distrust each other, but because we respect structure. My father lives quietly in the Queen Street house. Probation completed. No corporate authority, no board seat. He paints the shutters himself now. My mother lives independently. She keeps her own bank account. She no longer asks permission before speaking. My brother works steadily. No spotlight, no golden child narrative, just work. As for me, I don't carry anger. I don't carry vindication. I carry documentation. I carry standards. And I carry one line from Margaret Hale that matters more than any share certificate ever did. Do not fight for the company if it costs you your independence. It didn't, because I didn't fight for inheritance. I fought for structure. And once the structure was corrected, everything else aligned. If you're sitting at your own version of that table right now, being dismissed, overlooked, told to wait your turn, remember this: you don't need to scream. You don't need to beg. You don't need to win publicly. You need to build quietly. You need to document. You need to decide what you will and will not carry forward. Revenge fades. Structure lasts. That's the part nobody applauds. But it's the part that holds. And that is how the tables turned.